Deep in the Bolivian savanna, buried under 6 centuries of forest and grass, there is a city. Not a village, not a ceremonial site. A city with platforms rising 22 meters above the plain, with causeways wide enough to march an army through, with a network of canals and settlements stretching across a landscape that conventional science insisted could never support a civilization this large. The Kasarabe culture built it sometime between 500 and 1400 CE. And then, as far as official archaeology was concerned, it did not exist at all. I first came across the Kasarabe while researching something else entirely. The LiDAR data pulled me in, and I genuinely could not find my way back out. What followed, when researchers finally had the tools to look properly, was not the discovery of a lost city. It was the discovery of a lost world. And when DNA science followed the archaeology into the Amazon basin, the answer it returned was not the one anyone expected. In this investigation, we're going to reveal what LiDAR found beneath the Bolivian grassland, the genetic signal that connects Amazonian peoples to a founding lineage nobody mapped, and the answer that rewrites not just Amazonian prehistory, but the entire story of how humans first reached this hemisphere. Start with the simplest version of the problem. For most of the 20th century, the Amazon basin occupied a specific and largely unchallenged position in the scientific understanding of pre-Columbian America. It was a wilderness, vast, ecologically rich, and essentially empty of complex human organization. The reasoning seemed solid. Tropical laterite soils are nutrient-poor and structurally hostile to the kind of surplus agriculture that historically underpins urban civilization. The ecology required constant mobility. The environment rewarded small band flexibility, not the institutional investment that city building demands. The scientific consensus was not a fringe position. It was the mainstream, held across archaeology, anthropology, and historical geography for generations. Then, in 2022, a team led by Heiko Pruamirs of the German Archaeological Institute pointed LiDAR sensors at the Llanos de Mojos savanna in Bolivia. LiDAR strips vegetation from the landscape digitally, revealing the contours of what lies beneath. What Pruamirs and his colleagues found, published in Nature that year, had no precedent in the literature on lowland Amazonia. 26 sites of the Kasarabe culture, previously undetected or underdocumented, spread across the savanna. At the center of the largest site, called Kotoka, stood a monumental earthwork platform rising 22 meters above the plain. Around it, a planned urban layout of concentric rings, plazas, and elevated causeways connected the settlement to others across the landscape. Sit with the scale of that for a moment. These structures were built, maintained, and inhabited across nearly 1,000 years, from approximately 500 CE to 1400 CE. The Roman Empire rose and fell during the construction window of what we were told was an uninhabitable forest margin. Medieval Europe completed its cathedral building era. The Kasarabe culture was doing this simultaneously, in a place official science had essentially written off as architecturally inert. The detail that stopped me when I first read the paper was not the height of the earthworks, it was the causeways. Straight, elevated, engineered roadways connecting the Kasarabe settlements to each other across a network that the LiDAR survey could trace for dozens of kilometers in every direction. This was not accidental clustering. This was infrastructure, planned, maintained, and extended over centuries by a society that knew exactly what it was doing and had the organizational capacity to keep doing it. But LiDAR has a limit. It shows you what was built. It cannot tell you who built it, where those people ultimately came from, or why the civilization that engineered the Bolivian savanna vanished so completely that the most sophisticated archaeological surveys of the 20th century missed it entirely. That question required a different science altogether. When researchers turned population genetics toward the Amazon, the working expectation was reasonable. Native American populations derive from founding migrations out of Siberia, crossing the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas between roughly 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. That founding lineage spread south through North America, into Central America, down the Andes, and eventually into the lowland rainforests. Amazonian peoples, under this model, should be genetically continuous with other Native Americans, close relatives of Andean populations, distant relatives of North American groups, all ultimately traceable to the same Siberian founding event. In 2015, Pontus Skoglund at Harvard Medical School and the Broad Institute, working with David Reich and a team of international collaborators, published a genome-wide analysis covering 30 Native American groups across the hemisphere. The paper appeared in Nature. When the analysis reached the Amazonian populations, specifically the Surui, Caritiana, and Chavante peoples of Brazil, the data returned a signal that the founding migration model had no explanation for. These Amazonian groups showed statistically significant genetic affinity to populations on the other side of the planet, to Andaman Islanders, to Aboriginal Australians, to Papuans, not as statistical noise, not as a marginal rounding effect, as a real, reproducible genomic signature that demanded accounting for. The researchers named this founding lineage Population Y, from Ipiquera, the Tupi-Guarani word for ancestor. Here is the detail that stopped me when I first read it. Population Y does not represent ancient Australians crossing the Pacific. The genetic distance is far too deep for that explanation, and the archaeology of Pacific seafaring in this period does not support transoceanic contact of this kind. What Population Y represents is something more fundamental, a founding lineage of the Americas that shared a common ancestor with the populations that eventually became Australasians, a lineage that traveled to the Americas via a route or timing distinct from the main Siberian migration, and arrived genetically distinct from every other founding population of the hemisphere. David Reich described the finding as evidence of a second migration that contributed ancestry to groups found almost entirely in lowland South America, not in the Andes, not in the Caribbean, not in North America, in the Amazon. The city builders and the anomalous genome occupied the same basin, but the researchers looked more carefully at the distribution of this signal, and the picture became something considerably more unexpected. The Population Y signal does not distribute evenly across the Americas. That, it turns out, is almost as significant as the signal itself. High-altitude Andean populations show it minimally or not at all. North American groups show no meaningful trace. Caribbean peoples are similarly absent. The signal concentrates in lowland South America, in the river systems and savannas of the Amazon basin, precisely the geography that LIDAR is now revealing as the site of monumental pre-Columbian civilization. In 2018, a team including Cosimo Post and Nathan Nakatsuka published an ancient DNA analysis in Cell covering 49 individuals from Central and South America, spanning 10,000 years of prehistory. The study found the two founding population model reflected not just in modern genomes, but in the ancient record, a real feature of Amazonian prehistory, not an artifact of recent mixing or migration. Population Y was there in deep time. It predates the Khazarabe city-building era by millennia. Consider what that means structurally. Population Y's founding lineage arrived in the Amazon at minimum 10,000 years before the earthworks at Kotoka were raised. For 10,000 years, this founding stock occupied the lowland forest and savanna. They learned the river systems. They managed the landscape. They passed the knowledge forward. The civilization that LIDAR revealed was not an anomaly that appeared from nowhere. It was the culmination of an unbroken sequence of Amazonian cultural development reaching back to a founding population that no one had mapped. The land itself records this. Terra, Preta, Amazonian dark earth, covers tens of thousands of square kilometers across the basin. It is unambiguously human in origin. It was created through the deliberate incorporation of charcoal, bone, and organic waste into naturally nutrient-poor tropical soils across generations of managed occupation. The conventional model said the Amazon could not support civilization because the soil was wrong. The correct observation is that the soil was engineered. The people who made the Earth also made the cities. The people who made both carried in their genomes a founding signature that points to one of the strangest origin stories in the human record. Pull back from the genetic detail for a moment and consider what it actually means, taken whole. The Amazon was not an empty wilderness when Europeans arrived. It was a managed landscape of extraordinary scale, occupied by populations that historical demography estimates in the millions, built by peoples whose founding lineage extends back into deep prehistory under a model no one predicted. The Terra Preta stretches across a territory larger than France. The LIDAR causeways connect urban centers. The population Y signal extends the chain of Amazonian occupation back to a founding event that broke every assumption about how the Americas were settled. The fringe theories that circulate around Amazonian prehistory, the lost Atlantis depositing its survivors in the rainforest, the ancient extraterrestrial infrastructure builders, exist precisely because mainstream scholarship spent a century denying that indigenous Amazonian peoples could have produced this complexity on their own. The genetic data closes that vacuum definitively. Population Y's affinity to Australasians is a product of shared deep ancestry, not of transoceanic contact. The Terra Preta is the product of agricultural management, not alchemical inheritance from a vanished supercivilization. The causeways were built by the people who lived there, whose ancestors had been building and managing this environment for 10,000 years before the earthwork era began. The answer has no need of mythology. The real answer is stranger than any myth required. What 1492 initiated in the Amazon was not discovery. It was catastrophe. European contact introduced pathogens to which Amazonian populations had no accumulated immunity. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 90% of the pre-contact population within a century of first contact. The forest that later explorers described as primeval wilderness was not primeval. It was regrowth. The canopy closed over the causeways. The earthworks eroded back into the savanna. The civilization did not disappear because it was defeated or absorbed. It was killed, at a scale and a speed that left almost no institutional memory behind to tell the observer what had been lost. What persisted was the genome. Here's the thing that stays with me. With me after spending weeks inside this research. Not the scale of the cities or the height of the earthworks. What I cannot stop thinking about is the timeline. Population Y arrived in Amazonia thousands of years before the Kasarabe culture raised its first platform. Thousands of years of settlement, of soil management, of cultural transmission across generations before the city-building era began. The Amazon was not the site of a civilization that appeared suddenly and mysteriously. It was the culmination of a project so long in the making that its foundations were laid before the Egyptian Old Kingdom, before Stonehenge, before almost anything else that archaeology has taught us to call ancient. The descendants of the city builders are alive today. They carry in their genomes the population Y signal, a founding lineage that arrived in the Americas by a route nobody mapped, that built in a place nobody believed was buildable, and whose cities were confirmed by science within the last 3 years. That is not historical distance. That is a living thread. The Amazon was never empty. The forest was never pristine. The soil was engineered. The cities were real. We just didn't have the tools to see what had always been there.